Hi there, I'm Grant, and thank you all for coming once again. And let me give us a very brief look back and then a brief look forward where we've been. Let's see, 2 weeks ago, 2 weeks ago we started off by thinking about the concept and the category of gender. And that's very important for understanding the place of women in American Christianity. It's not a question of biological sex, it's a question of how women have learned to present themselves and how men have learned to present themselves. And so that makes all the difference in the world. And so there are a variety of roles that we all assumes, almost all of us assume when we are young. And then I suggested that gender also expresses itself in vulnerability. Women have been vulnerable in ways that men have not. Okay, and then I took up the question of why bother, and I argued that it's just a question of fairness. For one thing, 51% of the people in the United States are women, and 58% of Methodist members are women, and about 65% of the people who have attended revival meetings over the centuries have been women, so it's just a matter of fairness, okay? And it's a live issue. It's an issue that is splitting denominations. And even if it's not splitting denominations, for us, it's a question of how can we achieve equity. And so it's very much a live issue. And then, you know, it's just really important to remember this matter of who was at the tomb first. Who saw Jesus first? It was women. Then the second week, we took up the question of roadblocks. And I offered some examples of roadblocks. And there are lots of examples, but I think that one that is so telling, and it comes from our secular culture, but it says so much about the lives we share, and that is we've had 116 Supreme Court justices, and a grand total of 6 of them have been women. 4 of them are sitting on the court right now, but that tells you something. Or to go way back in our history, just a tiny example of the kinds of roadblocks women have encountered. In 1692, way back in Massachusetts, we had the famous witchcraft trials, and 19 people were executed. 14 of them were women. So those examples just all over all of our history. And there are reasons for the roadblocks, and some of it's in the Bible, and some of it's in our culture. But there are also runways, and if you take courses in universities, you're only going to hear, I think, pretty much about the roadblocks. But there are also runways, and there are lots of examples of how women have transcended those roadblocks, and they have moved forward in just remarkable ways. And we have all kinds of examples of that. And suffice to say, the statistics are improving, especially for Methodists. And we look around, the statistics are improving. And you may remember I read that remarkable quotation from John Wesley. I mean, it's just amazing. 225 years ago, John Wesley had this extraordinary word to women. He said, "You are not playthings." Just amazing. You are not playthings. 220. I mean, there's something to be proud of in our background. Okay. Today, we're going to take up 3 women, and I will get to them in just a moment, but let me give you a hint where we're going. Next week, I'm going to try to talk about 4 women, and each of them represents something very important in our history, and that's why I'm going to try to squeeze in 4. One of them would be Pearl Buck, who sold more books than any other, probably any other author, but certainly any other woman in American history, a novelist of great repute. And she's also an important figure because she lost her faith. We've been thinking about women who are stalwarts of the faith. Well, not everyone has, and just to be honest about it, and we need to think about the reasons why she lost her faith, and I could say why the church failed her. That's part of our story too. We need to come to terms with it too. Then the second person we will discuss is Lottie Moon, who in many ways was the most famous missionary of the 19th century, and certainly an icon for Southern Baptists. And the last one will be Aimee Semple McPherson, sister, as she was known. And I think she was the single most prominent woman in all of American Christian history. She founded her own denomination, her own radio station, her own publishing empire. There were thousands of people, maybe tens of thousands, who felt that they had been healed by the touch of her hand. So I'll think of that third one. It's lost. I should have jotted it down. But anyway, so we'll look at different kinds of women at different junctures. Now, then the last week, Anna will be with us and Martha talk about their own experiences. Okay, so that'd be wonderful. All right. Now, today we're in the 19th century. Next week will be the 20th century. This is the 19th century. And three figures, Sojourner Truth, Dorothy Dix, and Frances Willard. And I have their dates up there, and I can't even read them myself, but if you want to know what they are, I can walk over there and I can tell you what they are. Sojourner Truth is, in some ways, the most interesting. And it's not to say she's any more important than the others, but it is to say she had the most extraordinarily interesting life. Spanned much of the 19th century. She was born a slave. She was enslaved. And quite interestingly, she was born in upstate New York. Her parents were enslaved. And her family to whom she was sold very early on were Dutch Reformed. And members of the Dutch Reformed Church in this little county in upstate New York. And so she took their name, Isabella Baumfree. But throughout her life, she had a heavy Dutch accent. And this was arresting to people, to encounter an ex-slave who had never been to school. She was unlettered, as they say. She was a forceful speaker, eloquent speaker, but came across as a strong Dutch accent. That's just not what they expected at all. She was tall, an imposing figure, and so the combination of the accent, the very strong voice, tall, imposing, she cut a striking figure. Later on, and I'll get to that, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth, and we'll talk about that. But when she was younger, she's known as Isabella Baumfree. The family that she was sold to treated her well, and she developed close ties with them. And there's every reason to think that she saw them as family, and they saw her as family. That did not abrogate the fact that she was enslaved. She was their legal property. But still, you know, history's complicated. And she stayed in touch with them as her family throughout her entire life. Now, we all know that blacks were liberated, and slaves were liberated. In 1865, what was it, the 11th Amendment. However, individual states emancipated slaves at different times. And the state of New York emancipated their slaves in 1827. So, Isabella Baumfree became a free black in 1827, but actually she left home a year before that. She had married, she bore 5 children, and when she achieved her freedom, she left her husband. You know, make of that as you wish. Remember the very first week, I talked about the role of prominent women in our history, and over we find that they have an unusual number of divorces or abandonments. And you just make of it what you will, except to say that their lives were a lot more complicated than the lives of men. So she left her husband. She did stay in touch with some of her 5 children. But she also left upstate New York and moved to New York City. Now, in New York City, some very interesting things happened to Isabella. And first of all, she changed her name to Sojourner Truth. Now, why? All right. She became affiliated with a Methodist perfectionist group. And what you may remember from Sunday school, perfectionism doesn't mean that we're perfect, but it means that John Wesley taught that we can come to a place where we no longer desire to sin. We can transcend the desire to sin. So we are in the process of perfection, moving toward perfection. Never get there, but we're in the process. All right. Now, some groups were much more radical about this than others. And she got involved with a group in New York City that were really radical. And there was a very exuberant emotional worship. And they thought they moved a long ways toward that goal of perfection. Okay. She saw herself as a witness to truth. Okay. So, she changed her name to Truth. Okay, that makes sense. But notice, a witness to truth. It didn't work out for her just to stay at home and know the truth. Rather, she had to publicize the truth. So, she becomes an itinerant witness to truth. So, she takes on the name Sojourner. I love this. And you just think of what's going into the thinking on her part. Go from Isabella Baumfree to Sojourner Truth. All right. She moves on from Wesleyan perfectionism into another group, which I think by any reasonable measure we could say was a bunch of kooks. Okay. Now this is a clinical term. It was known as the Kingdom of Matthias, okay? And the leader was a man named Robert Matthews, but it was known as the Kingdom of Matthias. Now, it was a commune, and they taught they had a number of teachings that were pretty interesting. Not terribly unusual in the time, but still historically interesting. Number one, they were millenarians, which means they expected the Lord to return anytime now, the millennium to begin anytime. They were strong advocates of temperance, and we'll get to that again later. Giving up alcohol, and there are reasons for giving up alcohol. And they were into holistic health practices, and that is, bathing and certain kinds of warm waters with salt in them, and certain kinds of foods that they would eat and not eat. Giving up sexual activity for all reasons except for procreation. So a variety of activities that were, marginal, all right, in the 19th century. And she gets all involved in this, all right. As often happens, though, with groups like this, the leader begins to have his own ethic, and he veers off the rails sexually and acquires what can only be called as concubines. And so Sojourner Truth leaves the Kingdom of Matthias. Now from there she moves into a group that was commonly known in the 19th century as the Millerites. Today we know them as the Seventh-day Adventists. Okay? The Millerites were founded by a man named William Miller. And we're not going to get into all the details here, but suffice to say that William Miller was a student of the Bible, a very, very close student of the Bible, and he was particularly interested in the numerical parts of the Bible, wherever he could find numbers in the Bible. And he calculated, by very close analysis of the Old Testament and how it might synchronize with the New Testament, he calculated that the Lord was going to return April 22nd of 1844. All right. And so people prepared for that. He was a persuasive preacher, and they absolutely prepared for this to happen. Well, when it didn't happen, it was called the Great Disappointment. But Miller didn't just roll over and play dead, nor did his followers roll over and play dead. Rather, what they did is they said, well, we miscalculated. All right. And the batteries in our calculator had run down. All right. So, the Lord is going to return October 22nd of 1844. And so the followers become very committed to this latter date, and the word spreads all over. All right. Well, what happens then the morning of October 23? Well, again, people don't just say, well, we're going to just join a fraternity at UNC. No, I mean, they decide that there's been another mistake And so Miller decided that what took place, that something took place in heaven, and I can't get into the numerical issues there, but suffice to say, he decided that something happened in the heavenly realms and that he had been basically correct. All right. Now at this point, very soon, Miller leaves the scene. All right. And he is succeeded by a woman named Ellen White. And I had thought about talking about Ellen White, but I think she's not quite as important for us as the three that I wanted to discuss. Suffice to say that Ellen White gathered up this group in the 1840s and 1850s, and she taught them, well, that the Lord is coming very soon, and she taught them that the Lord, Scripture, demands vegetarianism, and worship on Saturday, giving up all sexual activity except for procreation and anything that remotely related to sexual activity, masturbation, anything like this. So a variety of teachings. Ellen White had direct revelations from heaven, and she wrote her revelations, and there are multiple volumes of Ellen White's readings, revelations. Very powerful, charismatic woman. And eventually, we get the Seventh-day Adventists and a whole string of hospitals, university hospitals around the world. She moves from these teachings, which some of them are little, well, say, marginal, to some very, mainstream notions about health. Give up salt, give up condiments, give up fat. One of her followers was John Kellogg. Kellogg's Corn Flakes, okay? No sugar, Kellogg's Corn Flakes. Now, back to Sojourner Truth. She gets involved with the Millerites and becomes a proponent of these teachings, with the exception of the seventh-day part. Now, I want to call your attention to a couple things here. That all of these teachings, that Jesus is coming back to earth very soon, temperance, giving up sex, holistic health, vegetarianism, etc., communitarianism. This is all outside mainstream Protestantism, outside mainstream Catholicism for that matter. And it's not an accident that these teachings are propounded by women, because women are marginalized from the mainstream. And so it's in the interstices of the culture that they find a place to speak and to prophesy. After the Millerites, Sojourner moved on, and she, long story, got involved in abolitionism. Now she's black, she is a freed slave, she's been emancipated, and she feels that she has been called to move beyond these teachings into the abolition of slavery. And she allies herself with radical abolitionists, and the most radical was a man named William Lloyd Garrison, who had a newspaper called The Liberator, okay? And to show you how radical Garrison was, he taught that the North should secede from the South. Because the North should no longer be contaminated by its association with the South. And this is how radical he was. And I'm not sure how much of that she concurred with, but she certainly worked with William Lloyd Garrison. And she worked with a very, very prominent, one of the most prominent of all black abolitionists, Frederick Douglass. And together they held abolitionist meetings in the United States, throughout the north part of the United States. She becomes prominent for her assertiveness as a woman. She takes on an identity as a woman. She's not just simply a preacher out there. She is a woman who happens to be a preacher. She forefronts the fact that she's a woman, and so becomes famous for a line that she would say, and that is, well, actually what she said is, "Ain't I a woman?" Now that word had a different connotation then than it does now, but we would say today, "Aren't I a woman?" And all the teachings and the forcefulness that I have. And what else am I? I'm a woman. And you need to pay attention. Well, this woman, as it happens, gets interested in real estate. Okay? Just real estate. And she gets interested in how she could support herself, how she could make some money. Nothing wrong with that. We often think that these prophetic figures, oh, well, either they're charlatans and they're bilking people, or they live impoverished lives. Well, that's not true. She decided that there are ways to make money that are entirely legitimate. So she starts buying and selling real estate. Now, the reason I bring this in here is that in addition to all these other traits, Sojourner Truth has street moxie. All right? And she becomes quite wealthy. And beyond being wealthy, one of the ways that she becomes wealthy is that she writes an autobiography. And it's called A Narrative of the Life of Sojourner Truth. And it goes through multiple editions. Can't say a whole lot more about it. We're going to run out of time. I'll just say this. We all know Uncle Tom's Cabin, authored by Harriet Beecher Stowe, the single biggest selling book in the 19th century. Harriet Beecher Stowe and Sojourner Truth become friends. Again, another, it's almost predictable that these very, very strong women would somehow cast their lots together, and they would come together. Out of all the people in America, they would come together. And so Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes an article in a magazine that's still around called the Atlantic Monthly. A lot of us have it on our Kindle, on our phones. And it's called Libyan Sybil, S-I-B-Y-L. All right, Libyan Sybil. Libyan, black, and African, so sort of mysterious. But Sybil was an ancient prophet, someone who could see into the future. And so this article about her, the Libyan Sybil, Sojourner Truth, a lot of things are coming together. And wherever she went, she had an audience, for sure. Well, she ended up her life moving to the headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventists in Battle Creek, Michigan, which is, today where Kellogg's Corn Flakes comes from. And she buys land there and also gets involved with Quakers. And a lot of things about Quakers, but a couple of things about Quakers that are worth noting is one, Holy Spirit is inside. Remember, we go back to Anne Hutchinson. Holy Spirit is inside me, and also they're pacifists. So add this to all the things that Sojourner Truth is involved in. A part of her story that is not quite as uplifting, no fault of her own, is that after the Civil War, she felt that blacks, freed blacks in the South, would be cast upon the charity of their former masters. And white people are not going to be very inclined to take care of, or to go out of their way to take care of the men and women they had enslaved. So, Sojourner Truth realizes that they will be perhaps impoverished, destitute, migrant. They will be in very difficult economic circumstances. All that is very noble. She petitions Abraham Lincoln to set aside land in the West for ex-slaves so that they could go and settle and no longer be dependent upon white people's charity, but they could sustain themselves. Lincoln did not do that. And great many blacks did in fact go west, and they settled in Texas and beyond the Mississippi, and they're called exodusters. But they didn't take up the land that Sojourner Truth had worked very hard to provide them. She dies in, what did I say, in 1883. She lives to a ripe old age of, 88 years old. She has an extraordinary career. I think one thing we could say in looking at her is that she was an autodidact. She never learned to read, but she was a savant. She was someone who just understood what was going on in just a preternatural way, and people followed her. She had a great following, and all these reasons I've talked about is she was so unusual and so imposing. There have been numbers of biographies, as you might imagine. Historians have been fascinated with her, and particularly feminist historians have been extremely fascinated, including historians who have nothing to do, no particular sympathy with Christianity at all. So, Sojourner Truth. Dorothea Dix. Born in Maine, 1802. Her father was a minister, and is often the case with reforming women. They were PKs, and her father was not successful as a minister. He was not a successful minister financially, and so he had to let her go, in the sense to let her move from Maine to go live in Boston with some wards. And so, like many women, aspiring, ambitious women of the 19th century, she opens up a private school, a school for girls. Now, we don't have public schooling in the 19th century the way we do today. So she opens up a school for girls. Now, one of the students in her school is the daughter of a preacher whose name, I have to give you this name, a little bit of a detail, but it's worth it. His name is William Ellery Channing. And he's the most prominent preacher in Boston. Many people say most prominent preacher in America in the 1820s. He's a Unitarian, so he's on the liberal side of the theological spectrum. Today, Unitarians, I don't think, would consider themselves Christian, and I don't consider them Christian. They've moved off. They've moved off the spectrum. In those days, they were certainly within the spectrum of Christianity, but they were on the left side. They tended to be elite. They were the upper crust of the Protestant spectrum. And so she becomes involved with William Ellery Channing. She moves left theologically, isn't terribly troubled by doctrinal particularities, but basically is going to affirm that Christianity is calling for the reform of our society, and she's basically going to leave it there. Now, for many years, Dorothea Dix has a school. She's teaching. She's associating with these Unitarians, reform-minded, prosperous, okay. She herself suffers from tuberculosis. But more than that, she just has a series of vague ailments. And this is not a place where I can get into it, but in the 19th century there was a disease, which, for lack of a better word, which today we would call chronic fatigue syndrome. And it was often attributed to women, more than men, but both of them suffered from it. And the argument was men and women, but especially women, were incapable of dealing with the stresses of modernity. Now, I'm not saying that she was a victim of chronic fatigue syndrome. I'm just saying she had a lot of illnesses and vague maladies over the course of her first half of her life. All right. Key point is that she decides that she needs to go to England to restore her health. Now, I don't know why anyone would go to England to restore their health. You know, France, Italy, I can imagine, not England. Okay. But she does, okay. And there she gets involved with a man named William Tuke, T-U-K-E. And William Tuke is a very early pioneer of facilities for dealing with the mentally ill. And she is involved in this and begins to think that this is what she is called for. She comes back to Boston, and one Sunday morning, she's teaching a Sunday school class for women at a jail. No, not a hospital, a jail in East Boston, or in Cambridge. And she heard that there are mentally ill women. Now, in those days, they weren't called mentally ill. They were called insane. So we'll just go ahead and use the word. And it wasn't a pejorative word then, as it is now. There were insane women in the basement of this jail. And so she goes down And as she describes it, she was taken into a dark underground cavern, and there she discovered numbers of, was our words now, mentally ill women in cold, filthy cells. She's shocked. And this is a revelation. This is a kind of an epiphany moment for Dorothea Dix, where she's called. This is what I'm called. This is what I'm on this earth to do, is to do something about the problem of these women. So she enlists the help of a variety of well-placed reformers, including now Samuel Howe. Now, why is he important? He was the founder of asylums for the blind in Boston. And now you begin to see where we're going here. She's going to put together asylums for the insane, working with Samuel Howe, who has already started putting together asylums for the blind. We don't use the word asylums anymore, but that's what they were called then. She becomes convinced that the only way that she would be able to do anything to bring about an amelioration of the conditions that the insane were incarcerated in is to work with legislatures, state legislatures. So here's this woman who has been so recessive for so long, and now she's suddenly empowered. And so she works with the legislatures in the state of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and in every single one of those states she is successful in prompting these legislatures to allocate money for facilities to do something about the state of these individuals. A description, one of many descriptions, countless descriptions. This is Dorothea Dix describing a cell that one Abram Simmons is incarcerated in Providence, Rhode Island. The name means nothing, the place means nothing, it's the example that I want you to listen to. She said, 6 to 8 feet square. Think of this, 6 to 8 feet square, built entirely of stone and entered through 2 iron doors, excluding both light and fresh air, and entirely without accommodation of any description for warming or ventilating. The internal surface of the walls was covered with thick frost. The only bed was a small sacking stuffed with straw, and the bed was wet. And there he lay in utter darkness, encased on every side by walls of frost, his garments constantly wet, and only wet straw to lie upon, and a sheet of ice for his covering. This most dreadfully abused of men existed through this kind of winter. And then she says his teeth must have been worn out by constant and violent clattering for such a length of time, night and day, as he shivered in the abysmal cold. Numerous, constant descriptions of the people that she encountered, and she's called to do something about their lives. By 1844, she has traveled 10,000 miles by buggy in 18 states, visiting in each place where? Hospitals? No. Penitentiaries. Because they don't know what to do with the insane, and so they put them in jails, they put them in penitentiaries. There's one other place they put them as they called almshouses or poorhouses. So they're incarcerated in penitentiaries and jails and poorhouses. And it's all over the United States. She then does not take no for an answer, and so she decides the only way to really deal with this problem is to go to the federal government and get federal legislation to bring about changes. So she's successful in persuading the Senate and the House to allocate money for federal housing. and the President of the United States, Franklin Pierce, vetoes it. And Franklin Pierce's thinking was, as he put it, he said, if the federal government is called upon to care for the indigent insane, we next will be called upon to care for the indigent in general. And that's not the federal government's problem, to deal with poor people. This is the middle of the 19th century. This is not after the New Deal. So, she suffers a major reverse at the federal level, but she doesn't roll over and play dead. She goes back to England, and she works with the Queen, and they were able to bring about the establishment of asylums in England and in Scotland, and then she goes to Italy, and she works with Pope Pius IX, and in Italy, through the instrumentality of the Pope. During the war, during the Civil War, she takes over the training of Civil War nurses. After the Civil War, she becomes acquainted with a Japanese ambassador, and he becomes enchanted with what she has to say, and she goes to Japan, and there too, asylums are created in Japan. One of her early biographers described her this way: Dorothea Dix lifted the status of the insane from that of wounded beasts who are brutalized, chained, thrown food as if they were vicious dogs and left to freeze in the cold, and to that of troubled mortals who could be helped to regain their senses as they received understanding care that helped them reach the roots of their disturbances. Two codicils to this. Dorothea Dix was the founder of our hospital in Raleigh, founded in 1856 and stayed open until 2012. It wasn't actually named after her. It was named after her father, but all the same. And over the course of 160 years, more than 3,000 patients were housed in that hospital. But life's complicated. Dorothea Dix, for all the great things that she did, she resisted abolitionism. She's an upper crust white woman, and abolitionism just does not touch her. And she didn't actively oppose it, but she could not cooperate with abolitionism. And we see this over and over with reforming people in general, but including reforming women. There are certain things that they are committed to doing, and there are other things they just can't bring themselves to do. More than that, and what I find more difficult to explain, now you understand that resistance to abolitionism given white racism. What is more difficult to understand is that she actively opposed women's suffrage. Go figure. You know, it's just one of these things. People are complicated. I don't know what to say about that. Except, well, I think you can. She had reasons, but we don't have time to unpack that now. But she did an enormous amount of good. A driving person who changed our landscape in many ways. So this is Dorothy Dix. We have one more woman, and this is Frances Willard. I'm going to be sure to give us time to talk tonight. All right. Frances Willard. Should I add to the story to say historians tell us that Frances Willard was as well known in the 1880s and 1890s as Eleanor Roosevelt was in the 1930s. And I have no reason to doubt that. I'm not a specialist in these things, but I have no reason to doubt it because I hear it that she has this overwhelming presence. I mean, Sojourner Truth was important, and Dorothea Dix certainly was important. Frances Willard was important, but she had a lasting impact that may have gone beyond these others. Here, I need to read a bit of data to you, okay? Frances Willard's claim to fame, among other things, was that she was a leader of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. All right? Now, why is this important in the 19th century? It's important now, temperance, but let's think about the 19th century. Here are the statistics. In 1790, the average annual alcohol consumption for those over 15 was 34 gallons of beer and cider, 5 gallons of distilled spirits, whiskey, and 1 gallon of wine. That's average per person over the age of 15. How many gallons do you all have in the course of a... Now we're Methodists. The answer is 0, right? In 1830, the average American, it gets worse, the average American over age 15 consumed 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year. Now, I don't have figures on beer and cider, but 7 gallons of pure alcohol, whiskey, which is 3 times the amount consumed today. And in the year 1915, the average adult drank about 2.5 gallons of pure alcohol per year, which would be the equivalent of 13 drinks per week. And then by 1920, the average adult was drinking 10 drinks a week. Now, why do we have such a presence of alcohol in the 19th century? Well, there are reasons, and the reasons have to do with the economy. And to make this very, very brief, okay? Many people considered alcohol a food, okay? People believed that alcohol was a healthy, invigorating food because it came from corn, okay? And so it was not unusual to consume it at breakfast, lunch, dinner, and before retiring in the evening. It was also regarded as a cheap alternative to coffee and tea, which were much more expensive in those days than alcohol. It was thought that alcohol was safer than coffee and tea, and water especially, and milk, because this is before pasteurization, so alcohol was more resistant to germs, all right? And then the overabundance of corn on the frontier, the development of the railroads made it easy to transport the corn. Men, in particular, this is another story, learned to think that drinking was vital to their strength and their virility. On the other hand, increasingly in the 19th century, women were taught that it was inappropriate for them to fall into the maw of alcohol. So increasingly they rejected alcohol, and especially drunkenness, while it became acceptable for men. And this is part of what we know of as the double standard. And there's a lot of implications of that, but it's part of the double standard. Frances Willard sees it, just as Dorothy Dix sees it, her calling is to confront insanity and the way the insane were treated, mental illness. Frances Willard sees that her calling is to confront the scourge of alcohol in American life. She's a very strong woman, again, a PK, a preacher's kid, Methodist, a graduate of what was then Northwestern College and became Northwestern University. She founded the Women's College of Northwestern, but then she also founded the WCTU, Women's Christians Temperance Union. That isn't quite right to say that she founded it, but she invigorated it. She made it a living, vital organization. Before the end of the century, it had 27,000 regular members. But the WCTU did a lot more than combat alcohol. It fought for kindergarten, prison reform, 8-hour day, the rules, the laws that kept children from working in the factories where they could be wounded, fingers cut off, facilities for challenged children, in those days called handicapped children, for dependent children, orphans, federal aid to education, vocational training, combating prostitution. Today we call it sex work, but that's a term in the 19th century, or it was called a purity crusade. And to raise the age of consent. All these things Frances Willard threw her shoulder to the mill to accomplish. She joined the Knights of Labor, an overwhelmingly male labor union, to fight for what? Equality of wages, and she eventually declared herself a Christian socialist. But along with all these things, put all this together, Frances Willard also was very much involved in what she called, or what she considered, a strengthening of womanliness in the home. And she became an advocate of home protection for the woman who stayed at home. Now, these things don't all go together, in our thinking. But they did in her mind. And I think many historians would say that if there's any one person who was responsible for the 18th Amendment and the bringing about legislation for the 19th Amendment, bringing about the legislation for women's suffrage, it was Frances Willard. She didn't live a long life. She died at the age of 59. And one of the things that I would ask about all of these women, but maybe her in particular, because there were so many things she was involved in. I mean, go over that list of things. I mean, what was she not involved in? And she was challenged once by a reporter that says, "Look at all this stuff you're involved in. I mean, why don't you just focus on one thing, on temperance?" And she says, "No." She said, "My calling is to do everything." Yeah, right. My calling is to do everything. And if there's any one person who would have achieved it, it was Frances Willard. What do you think about all three of these people? Why the drive? That's another. I mean, maybe I can start there. Why this drive? Where does this come from? Where 99, I don't know how many % of human beings just stay home, and mind their business, raise their families, earn a living, whatever. But you have these three women who just cannot stay home, and they're driven to change the world. All right, thanks a lot, bye. Bye-bye.